Those who walk on water reside in the realm of mythology. What you are is a follower of Eusebius. It's in the Gospel of Jesus.
A reading from a forged letter of the Emperor Hadrian to Gaius Minucius Fundanus, the proconsul of Asia in the year 122 AD. I've received a letter that was written to me by your predecessor Cyrenius Granianus, a most illustrious man. I'm unwilling to pass over this communication in silence, lest people be disturbed and occasion be given to the informers for practicing villainy. Accordingly, if the people of your province can support this petition of theirs against the Christians with evidence so as to plead it before some court of law, I don't prohibit them from doing so. But I won't allow them to make use of mere entreaties and outcries, because it's far more proper that if anyone wants to make an accusation, that you inquire into it. So if anyone makes the accusation and furnishes proof that these men did anything contrary to the laws, you shall adjudge punishments in proportion to the offenses. And this, by Hercules, you shall give special heed to. If any man brings an accusation for the purpose of slander, arrest him because of his falsehood, and see to it that you punish him. That was a reading of the forged rescript of Hadrian to Minucius Fundanus. At the beginning of this series about Pliny's letter, I mentioned that the Christians of the 2nd century forged several imperial rescripts about persecution, which took the form of letters. And one of them was Pliny's letter. And this one that we just read supposedly comes from the Emperor Hadrian, who ruled after Trajan, and it was supposedly written only within a mere decade of Pliny's letter. But what don't we see mentioned or reflected anywhere in it? That's right, Pliny's effin' letter. This is sometimes called the rescript of Hadrian to Fundanus. Fundanus became the proconsul of Asia in the early 120s, Asia being essentially what we would now call Western Turkey. As it happens, Fundanus himself turns up in Pliny's letters. He's another Roman official, upper-class type. Pliny writes to him 3 times. One is just a friendly letter, and in the other 2, he asks him for a favor. The only reason we possess this rescript is because Justin Martyr happened to enclose it at the end of his apology book. Now, we know the ancient Christian narrative about persecution by now. We covered it extensively in episode 11. Christians are suspected and accused of all kinds of monstrous crimes, but when they're actually put on trial, all the Roman officials are interested in is whether or not they are Christians. If they admit to being a Christian, they're executed. If they deny it, they go free. And I talked about all the problems with this, and I talked about how this narrative is repeated throughout the next 50 years exclusively in Christian sources, but this persecution narrative is actually what Justin Martyr's apology book is about. Its whole argument is that you shouldn't be prosecuting us based on the name. You should rather look into whether we've committed any actual crimes, and if we have, then prosecute us based on those. And at the very end of the book, which is addressed to the Emperor Antoninus, who ruled after Hadrian, Justin attaches a copy of this rescript. And his purpose in doing so is to say to the emperor, if I didn't convince you with my list of 957 examples of cross-shaped items from the Old Testament, if I didn't convince you by explaining to you how the gods that you worship are actually all demons, if I didn't convince you by letting you know how annoyed our Master Jesus Christ was at people who have sex, I might just end up convincing you with this letter from the greatest and most illustrious Emperor Hadrian, your father. which says in a few words what I've been poorly trying to say for 68 entire chapters, which is that you shouldn't prosecute us based on the name, but you should rather look into whether we've committed any actual crimes, and if we have, then prosecute us based on those. And that is indeed what the Hadrian rescript appears to say. Now, Justin, in his book, never mentions Pliny's letter, which, by the way, practically screams out to be mentioned by him, and St. Eddie himself said that the fact that Justin doesn't mention the Pliny letter was to him the gravest strike against its authenticity. So he doesn't mention the Pliny letter. A homework assignment for theologians should be to explain exactly why, but he does mention this Hadrian letter. And what the Hadrian letter appears to say is that Christians shouldn't be persecuted based on outcries of the mob, but should have a formal case brought against them by an accuser. But if they're punished, it can only be for, quote, doing anything contrary to the laws. That is not what the Pliny letter said, in Trajan's response. What the Pliny letter said in so many words was that Christianity was the crime. Trajan said to Pliny that if they are prosecuted and proved guilty, they should be punished. And what he means by that is if they are proved guilty of being a Christian. He's not referring to regular crimes because he specifies that he's talking about people who are accused before Pliny as Christians. And then he says that to get out of it, all they need to do is offer prayer to the gods, obviously conveying that Christianity is what's illegal here, unless he's implying that offering prayer to the gods can clear someone in any trial, which would be quite the precedent to be setting. So this is a conflict with the Hadrian letter, which appears to only be interested in prosecuting Christians for specific crimes. Now, some might say that, well, maybe being a Christian was a specific crime. Well, first of all, if it was, then there's no way in Hades that Justin Martyr would then have included Hadrian's letter in his book. And more importantly, we just spent the last 2 episodes, 3 hours inclusive, of demonstrating that there was no law on the books condemning mere Christianity in the 1st century or early 2nd century. Trajan's response does not deal with the secondary crimes at all, even though Pliny did raise that question in his letter. So his lack of response to it is another homework assignment, another tarea assignment for the theologians, whereas Hadrian's letter is only interested in the secondary crimes and does not appear to even be aware of such an idea as whether Christianity itself is the crime. Now, here's the thing. We can talk all day about the typical reasons that are usually given by skeptics who question Pliny's letter. We can talk about Pliny portraying Christians as this gargantuan threat, yet somehow not getting around to writing about them until he's about 50 epistles deep. Instead, he chose to write first about things like asking Trajan to find a job for his mother-in-law's friend. We can talk about Pliny's letter being 3 times as long and 3 times as jam-packed with filler as anything else in Book 10 of the letters where it appears. He spends less time describing how he drained a lake than he does writing about the Christians in Bithynia, which, by the way, neither he nor any of the other Romans in the region, including Dio Chrysostom, ever mention again until the time of Constantine. We can talk about the fact that Pliny's letter has like 8 New Testament references. We can ask why Pliny didn't know anything about Christians despite being a lawyer in Rome for 3 decades, despite effectively being the president of the Roman Empire and based in Rome that whole time. The same city of Rome where the Nero's Great Fire persecution supposedly happened. We can ask why Pliny says that he doesn't know what crime Christians should be charged with. And in the very next sentence, he's talking about how he was charging Christians with crimes and executing them. We can ask why we are told that the Christians were tanking the local economy, yet we see neither hide nor hair of Christians again in this region of Pontus in our records until the 3rd century. We can ask why Pliny seems to rally back and forth between being the dopey, clueless administrator who's never heard of this superstition and being the stereotypical, soulless Roman persecutor that's straight out of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, as Neil Godfrey pointed out. Those are the typical arguments that are usually given. And those are all valid arguments against authenticity, and I'm going to go into detail on all of them. But the true basis of anyone's argument should always be the myth of persecution and how it's leveraged in this text. The Pliny letter accepts, repeats, and amplifies the late 2nd century Christian narrative about their own treatment by the Roman state in a way that finds no corroboration in secular sources, that doesn't make any sense given what we know about the laws and customs of the time, one that is highly stereotyped, and one that appears to have been developed for sectarian purposes, and one that is only found here and in the writings of the 2nd century mainstream Christian clergy. This embellished narrative of the early persecution of Christians, which is confusing, but confusing in a very specific way, is just flat out assumed by the author of this letter as historical fact. And this letter is supposed to have been written by a Roman, a top official, a powerful member of this very society that's doing the persecuting, and whom we would therefore expect would have much more to say than merely expressing a kind of dull confusion. But here he is a passive participator. He is a pawn of the forger. He has no agency. His actions in the letter are taken at the sufferance of the persecution trope. The persecution trope is the key argument. And modern Christian apologists whose arguments for the authenticity of the Pliny letter basically amount to a website told me that all scholars agree that it's real, they repeat their stock arguments, but they never engage with the persecution trope, like why was Christianity illegal in Pliny's mind, in Trajan's mind? If Christianity wasn't illegal, then why was Pliny putting the question to these people? If it was illegal, then when was it made illegal and by whom? And if Pliny for some reason didn't know any of those things, why didn't Trajan know them? Why didn't his highly educated personal secretaries and legal experts know about them? One of the smartest things that Pliny says in Book 10 is in letter 81, where he asks Trajan for advice and he says, "I wanted to hear from you because this decision is very likely to create a precedent." So precedents are in mind for him, and that's far from the only time he expresses that concern. Yet in the Christian letter, no precedents are sought, none are given. Trajan doesn't lay down a precedent. In fact, he says it's not possible to lay down a precedent because in the forger's mind, the precedent is the persecution trope. These are not real people writing to each other. These are characters, participants in a dialogue, in a play. And the play is called The Persecution Trope by David Mamet. And modern apologists hardly ever address this, but the theologians who have written about Pliny's letter are constantly fretting over it, trying to get it to all make sense. You and I and the theologians are the only ones who are dealing with this issue because we realize how important it is. Now, apologists and the everyday believers and people on the internet that want to accuse you of being a logic bro the second you say that any Christian text is fake, blissfully unaware. They are ex parte to this discussion. All they care about is angrily declaring that the Pliny letter is genuine. It's just like what I said about the conflicts within Paul's letters in episode 7, their view of salvation, their view of Torah. The parties to that discussion are you, me, and the critics and theologians. We all recognize that there are conflicts in these writings, and the battle is really over how to explain these conflicts. Apologists, believers, and the "you're just a militant atheist, logic bro" crowd, no interest or awareness. But the situation outlined in the Pliny letter makes no sense unless we accept the standard assumptions of the contemporary Christian worldview of the time, which is that they were universally hated and persecuted for the name, reviled by the mob, ostracized and scorned, so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at them as they halt by them, and condemned unfairly, as were the Maccabean martyrs, as were the martyrs of the Kitos and Bar Kokhba wars, as were the legendary apostles like James the Just, as was Jesus. Hadrian's letter here from the reading is actually the response that we should have expected Trajan to give to Pliny, namely, don't just listen to the angry mob who's imputing all manner of hateful crimes to these poor fellows. Instead, do what we do as Romans. Have a delator bring them in and try the case, and see if they actually violated a specific law of some kind. If it turns out that the delator was basing his accusation on mere rumors, then punish him accordingly. We don't want our legal system being abused. And Hadrian himself, we have several edicts of his in the Roman law compilation called the Pandecta. And assuming they're genuine, which is by no means even close to being a certainty, we see that fair justice was a particular concern during his reign. And if it turns out that these other edicts of his here in the Pandecta did not genuinely come from him, their mere presence in this digest still shows that this was a major concern of the Roman government in general. But Hadrian issued an edict to the legate of the province of Cilicia, about how important it was for the judge to evaluate the dignity and reputation of witnesses and how to assess their testimony. He placed a high value on witness testimony in general. In another edict, he angrily says that it's unacceptable to convict someone based on written depositions whenever witnesses are available. He says the same thing in another rescript. He talks about how important witnesses are, and he talks about paying their expenses. We see here a persistent concern that justice should be administered fairly. So the focus in these edicts, just as in our reading, the rescript to Fundanus, is on fairness in legal proceedings. And as with anything like this in the Roman Empire, it's not that they were necessarily these bleeding heart types. It was that they hated the idea of things not being done properly, And here in this rescript from the reading, we see the same thing. But what we don't see there is Christianity itself being considered a crime, as we saw in Pliny's letter, and which would have been necessary to mention if Christianity was illegal, or more to the point, if Pliny's letter were indeed genuine and had only been written a scant 10 years before this. Now, my own theory is that this rescript of Hadrian did not originally have anything to do with Christians. If it was genuine, it was originally a statement on general principles about how regular trial procedures should be followed, no matter how desperate the outcries of the mob. To transform it into a document that's now focused on Christians, all one would have to do would be to add only 3 little words, even in Greek, because where it would have said, if the people of your province can support this petition of theirs with evidence so as to plead it before some court of law, I don't prohibit them from doing so. It could easily be altered to say, if the people of your province can support this petition of theirs against the Christians with evidence so as to plead it before some court of law, I don't prohibit them from doing so. Nothing else in the letter has to do with Christianity. We don't find any of our usual typhoon of tropes, like whether the name alone should be tried. What about the crimes associated with the name? You have to sacrifice to the gods 50 times while saying the alphabet backward. We don't hear anything else about the accused or why they were being accused. Now, some might say to me here, another accusation of forgery with no evidence, but I want to quickly address 2 things. One, there is no theologian, there is no scholar who looks at this thing or who looks at the Pliny letter and says, this all seems to be quite in order. As I alluded to earlier, they all notice the difficulties, the problems that arise from a simple, straightforward reading of these texts, and they try to develop papers and hypotheses to overcome them, which it's a good thing those papers aren't more widely read, because then people outside the academy would feel much less settled on the genuineness of these things. A good example is with this persecution trope that I keep mentioning. When you read their papers about the origins of persecution or how the Pliny letter addresses the topic of persecution, you'll find that most of the time they do recognize these issues, but the hypotheses that they come up with to explain them are alarmingly conjectural and insecure and sparse. The difference here with this show is that forgery in the interest of advancing the sect is being posited in every case as the most likely hypothesis. And I think that that actually ends up holding up anywhere and everywhere, including here, but it's impossible for a biblical studies academic to embrace a forgery hypothesis because doing so would threaten too many other aspects of their paradigm. I mentioned in episode 4 about how they're unwilling to discount those ancient Christians on the origins of the Gospel of Mark, that it came from Peter's preaching, even though accepting that makes it basically impossible to learn the true origins of Mark. I'm sure that many theologians wish they could just come out, like many did in the 19th century, and say that, yeah, that whole damn Josephus passage about Jesus is a fraud. Just jettison that damn thing. It causes way too many more problems than it solves, but they can't because they have a shared language, a shared thought world, a shared set of assumptions, and an internal logic for their worldview. And if you start making exceptions here and there, it's like, okay, Josephus gets tossed. Okay, now what about every other questionable source? What about Papias? What about Dionysius of Corinth? What about the little labyrinth? They just can't afford to examine a forgery hypothesis too thoroughly. So at the everyday, I'm arguing with the born in the 2nd century guy on Facebook level, yeah, all theologians do agree that the Pliny letter is genuine. Most theologians agree that the Hadrian letter is genuine. But I'm sharing throughout this series insights from their papers, and I did that especially with these last 2 episodes about historical persecutions to show that at their writing tables, they're beating their brains out trying to make these things work. And the second thing on this, to those who would say, here comes another forgery accusation, is that for some reason in our time, the early 21st century, the conventional wisdom seems to be that anyone who questions ancient Christian text is doing so because of an agenda. And I don't mean like an agenda seeking to tear down Christianity as such, but more like trying to further and advance a specific worldview, which is just as dogmatic, just as anti-intellectual as a firmly Christian worldview would be. And many today take pleasure in occupying a kind of middle ground, the sort of extremism on both sides is bad kind of thing. But there's no sides here. Either a narrative makes sense or it doesn't. In this case, if Pliny's letter is genuine, then Hadrian's letter cannot be genuine, because Justin in his time is complaining that Christians are persecuted for their name alone, a state of affairs which was supported in Pliny's letter, but would have been effectively repealed by Hadrian's letter. Now, it may not be surprising to learn that in the 19th century, many big-name theologians actually considered this Hadrian letter to be an outright forgery. And that's no longer the case today. Now it's usually universally seen as genuine, although nothing really changed that would have justified that shift. It's not like we were able to secure Hadrian's DNA in amber and resurrect him using reconstituted frog DNA, and he told us that it was a genuine rescript. It's more so that Christian scholarship has gotten more conservative since that time. Because back then, given how higher education worked at that time, you had a much greater chance of, shall we say, more iconoclastic people ending up in a seminary. For a lot of them, the church was their best route to a higher education. But at least in the United States, with things like the GI Bill, that all started to change. And now anyone who darkens the doorstep of a seminary is usually a bona fide believer. But the reasoning of the 19th century theologians was that Pliny's letter ends up with Christians being persecuted for the name. Hadrian's letter says that they can only be charged with specific crimes. Justin Martyr in the 150s is still complaining that Christians are being persecuted for the name. Hence, the imperial policy in Justin's time was still the same as it had been in Pliny's time. And Justin was using this forged Hadrian letter to change that state of affairs and make it look as if a Roman emperor had weighed in on this issue and declared that Christians should be tried just like any other criminals, which was Justin's main purpose in writing his own book. And there are other arguments that they advance to support the idea that this rescript is a forgery. For example, Hadrian gets the previous governor's name wrong. In the first sentence, he calls him Serenius Granianus, when in fact his actual name was Quintus Licinius Silvanus Granianus. And this is a mistake that would happen if a forger didn't know the actual name of the person, but copied it from some bogus list that he looked up. And notice too that Hadrian, in writing this letter, is not responding to the actual current governor to whom he's addressing it, but as he says, he's responding to a question he received from the previous governor. In other words, he's referencing something that happened off screen, which would provide a forger with an additional layer of cover. So the forger would be like, okay, I'm going to have Hadrian write to Fundanus, but I don't want to have to create a whole backstory for whatever Fundanus was dealing with. I don't want my audience to expect a follow-up letter here, let alone an entire series. So I'll make it out to where Hadrian was writing to Fundanus, but was referring to a question raised by a now conveniently retired predecessor. And then it's like, oh shit, who was Fundanus's predecessor? I have no idea. Well, I'll look it up in this list I found where it's so sloppily written that it looks like I'm trying to read Jerry Lundegaard's list of the stolen vehicle VIN numbers. I guess that looks like Cyranus or Selenius. I don't know, I'll just put Serenius to split the difference. Another thing, Hadrian does not refer, of course, to Trajan's communication with Pliny, which he is essentially overturning here. It was only a law passed 10 years earlier by his own father, adoptive father, but it's usually argued today that Pliny's letter and Trajan's response were only meant to pertain to a small local outbreak of Christianity that had only local application within specific narrow geographical limits, like only in this one corner of Bithynia and Pontus, It's like, this is just the minimalism of convenience, just like we see in modern depictions of the historical Jesus. I mean, Tertullian considered Pliny's letter to have worldwide application. I mean, to him, it was like in the top 5 most important things that ever happened in the history of the universe. So you can't just eagerly accept his testimony and say that it proves that the Pliny letter was genuine, but then say, well, he completely misunderstood every single element of it, because then the question can be raised that what else did he misunderstand in his books? And saying that the Pliny letter was meant to only apply to like 20 square miles of the Roman Empire also raises questions about how widely Book 10 of Pliny's Epistulae circulated in the 2nd century, because if it was genuine, and if it was circulated widely enough to where Tertullian came across it, just like some random Christian schleprock from the outskirts of Carthage, then people in the actual imperial government would have come across it, would have been aware of it. It would have been referenced by Hadrian here. The idea that Trajan's response to Pliny was nothing more than a local, one-off situation is just revisionist history. And if we want to avoid that type of revisionist history, then we're left with a choice. We can accept Hadrian's letter or Pliny's letter. And I think most people would rather want to accept Pliny's letter. It's just too important for too many people to lose. And if we do that, then we are left here with the Hadrian letter, a Christian forgery of an imperial rescript of the 2nd century that doesn't say anything positive about Christians, has kind of a confusing logic behind its forgery. Like, okay, I get that they want the Romans to back off when it comes to persecution, but what? Like, do they expect a Roman judge to be fooled by this? Aren't they worried that a Roman jurisconsult could expose this as a forgery? And if the Christian forger went to all this effort, why didn't he take advantage of this opportunity to say something positive about Christianity? He could have had Hadrian say 100 different things that wouldn't have tipped the forger's hand, but would have maybe put Christians in a better light. In short, what we have here is a Roman legal document that unequivocally was forged by a Christian, or in this case, altered by a Christian, simply because they, in their mind, thought that in some way it might help, even if they didn't really understand how it could be put to use. Well, whatever logic that this forger applied here is what I'm saying was applied in the case of the forgery of the Pliny letter. And in this series, we'll go on to look at 2 similar examples of this same thing. And note the similarities, even where, as I pointed out, the Hadrian letter doesn't appear to be aware of the Pliny letter's existence. In both cases, the emperor is writing briefly to give advice on trials of Christians in an Anatolian province, writing to the governor in both cases very concerned with the regular order of Roman legal procedures. In both cases, very concerned with slanderous accusations by anonymous informants. A Christian cleric of the 190s AD read this altered letter of Hadrian and used it as one of his templates to write a new version, one which would end up as part of a florilegium that would cross the desk of Tertullian not long after. A version that took the theme of this letter and brought it more in line with the persecution narrative that he was familiar with. A version that sought to accomplish things that this cleric saw as more realistic. We don't have much chance of being treated like regular Romans, like in the situation that Hadrian's letter was trying to set up, but maybe we can achieve an outcome that makes the persecution, whether real, imagined, or exaggerated, less indiscriminate, and makes it so we won't be simply rounded up or ratted out by an informant if the village mob has some vendetta against a Christian, or especially an ex-Christian. Let's try to achieve these outcomes without also making it appear that our belief system is completely accepted by the idolatrous pagan empire, because if they did appear to accept it, it would certainly compromise our legitimacy in the eyes of our followers, the unwashed hordes, because we keep repeating to them over and over that they're set apart from the world and will be rejected by the world. And all this is what led to the creation, using the text from our reading as a template. All this is what led to the creation of Pliny's letter to Trajan by a Christian cleric in the 4th quarter of the 2nd century, right on the money. You're listening to Born in the 2nd Century, and it's now September 1st, 2021. This is episode 13 of the tri-weekly endeavor to explore the lateness of Christian origins, hosted by Chris Palmero. The music for today's broadcast was provided by the recording group Pompeii Gray. I recently shared the link to this show in a pretty big forum, and it got an overwhelmingly positive response, but with a few detractors. And just guess what was the first thing that those detractors brought up? That's correct. Pliny letter, Pliny letter, Pliny letter, Pliny letter. I threw that last mispronounced one in for such listeners as may be joining us from Illinois, but I have now yammered about this Pliny letter for 4.5 hours straight with no end in sight. But these detractors hadn't listened to the series. They didn't know that I'm doing a major Pliny special. And I bring this up because you find yourself dealing with certain tiers of Christian apologists. The lowest tier are the ones who are like true believers, but nonetheless don't know any of the background information. They'll just dismiss and mock alternative views outright because they've never been exposed to them. But there's a tier right above that where the apologists are armed with an array of basic catchphrases, Tacitus passage, Pliny letter, Josephus. And I would say that that's the tier that you encounter the most. And many of them are what I would call unlapsed apologists who were raised Christian, really struggled with their faith as an adult, possibly spent time as an atheist, but now they've come back to the fold, but it's with conditions. They're not going to accept anything that's too fundamentalist, too out there, respect their boundaries basically, but they're believing Christians again. And that's fine. But what happens a lot of the time is that these unlapsed apologists end up being more vehement when it comes to shooting down alternative views than even fundamentalists, because in their struggle to reclaim their faith, they've constructed a careful narrative in their minds of how Christianity came together. What does Christianity mean? They've made it make sense to them. And they're very protective of that and very impatient with anyone whom they perceive as trying to wreck that little ship in a bottle. As I said earlier, they see any threat to the conventional narrative as an instance of extremism, but extremism from the other side, so to speak. And they don't want to go back to that old way of extremist thinking, so they aggressively react to it whenever they encounter it. And it's like, please don't make me a character in your strange journey. I don't want to be one of the allegories in your postmodern Pilgrim's Progress. You're living all over me, as the Dinosaur Jr. album said. Because all I'm doing is a show that questions why exactly it is that Christianity doesn't seem to get off the ground until 5 generations later than its own religious text claimed that it did. And also, I want to make it clear, I may not be a Christian, well, even though I guess I'm technically stuck being a Catholic since you supposedly cannot renounce Catholicism, but with this, I am operating completely within the Christian tradition. Out of the hundreds of sources that I've looked at and even cited on air for this, all but 7 or 8 have been Christian theologians, some of them rather fervent ones. And I'm nowhere near as brutal as some of the commentators that I've read who come from Christian backgrounds. I'm rather toning it down somewhat compared to them. If these detractors were more familiar with the literature, they would have known that. The fact that these radical conclusions are being drawn by me is really more of a YP than an MP for Christian apologists, because I'm really developing arguments out of research and conclusions that were done by Christians. I mean, episode 1 was called The Abandoned Road, and that's what I meant by that. The people who built the road were radical Christian theologians. But anyway, this anecdote about the apologist reminds me of something else. I would ask faithful listeners who enjoy the show to like and subscribe, much as I asked the Catholic priest to do in episode 9, but also to leave a review, a positive one, I would have thought. I'm not going to push it too much, but just to let you know, they're coming. The apologists are coming. They're coming like those endless Jebediah Springfield heads in Bart's Nightmare, where you have to jump over them in succession. And we're going to need all the help we can get here at Second Century Productions Studios. But today we go back to our close reading of Pliny's letter to Trajan about the Christians, Epistle 1096 and 1097. We had to deviate somewhat in order to fill in the background of the legal foundation of the letter, and we even continued that today in the opening reading, but we're going to keep making our way through the letter, and the show has moved to a more regular schedule now. I want to release all upcoming shows every third Thursday. And with this Pliny series, I'm basically going to stop the reading in each episode once we reach episode length. I'm a bit apprehensive about that because I may have to stop sometimes after I've made a particularly weak argument, but it should work out. And the series will end once we finish the letter and then maybe have like a short wrap-up episode. My hypothesis here is that Pliny's letter was forged by a Christian cleric of the late 2nd century who realized that if the horror stories of Justin Martyr about persecution were true, and he may have been experiencing somewhat of the beginning of that as the Romans indeed began to take notice of Christianity in the 180s and the 190s, if they were true, then a particular risk was posed by the fact that Christians are going to be blamed and accused by mobs of idiot villagers, and they may respond to something like a military defeat or natural disaster by demanding punishment of the local Christians. The forger wanted something in the emperor's name that said, if you want to accuse a Christian, you've got to come correct. It's got to be a real case brought by a real person. And if you point the finger at someone who can prove that they've abandoned the faith, then you lose the case and they go free, and you can pretty much never mess with them again when it comes to accusing them of crimes associated with Christianity. You have to go back to square one because the local authorities are even enjoined from arresting Christians on their own. The Christians have to be brought to trial. Now, in the forger's mind, and this is a key point, the forger is not suggesting that in any given town or village there are like armies of lapsed Christians whose presence might bring up a violent persecution and that might extend to him and his fellow parishioners. He's more concerned, when talking about the lapsed Christians, he's more concerned about what we would call heretics being caught up in these persecutions. And from the late 2nd century and 3rd century Christian literature, the belief of the Orthodox Christians is that most heretics, not all, but the overwhelming majority, see denying one's faith as a useful expedient. They don't go for the whole glorious martyrdom bit. In fact, one of them, Basilides, is quoted as saying that even innocent people who are executed must not really be innocent. Like, they must have done something wrong at some point. It's kind of like Martin Luther's secret sin. And the idea that this forger has in mind is that if you're an Orthodox Christian in a community that also contains heretics, which probably applies to every community in the late 2nd century where Orthodox Christians lived, you don't want to be wrapped up or associated in any way with the persecution that results from one of these people getting tagged. It's best if they deny Christ, roll clear of the nuclear blast, and you and your fellow Orthodox Christians aren't going to be next on the chopping block. It's a way to limit exposure. I read a post recently by someone who was arguing for the authenticity of the Pliny letter, and he said that it's genuine because it depicts some Christians being eager to deny Jesus. And of course, no Christian forger would supposedly ever represent his brethren as being keen to deny their faith. And it's like, first of all, sir, Pliny is made to say in the letter essentially that no true Christian would ever curse Christ. So the forger is effectively slamming these deniers as not being real Christians. And secondly, you got to crack open these church father books. Got to crack these things open. A statement like that makes it clear to me that that person has not read the books of Clement of Alexandria and Tertullius, where they are engaged in what appears to be a very acrimonious debate about whether it's appropriate to deny Christ during your trial. Tertullian says that some Christians of his time argued that when Jesus said the line warning his followers not to deny him, that was really referring to a hypothetical scenario in heaven after our deaths, where we will presumably get the opportunity to affirm or deny Christ. And he furiously argues against that using proofs from the New Testament. I remember I once watched an interview with a big Protestant apologist who was asked what he would say to the Pope if he ever got to meet the Pope. And I forget the question that he ended up coming up with, but he started his answer by saying, well, I'd look at the Pope and say, sir, or whatever it is that you call the Pope, I don't know. And it's like, my sir, I don't expect everyone to know the Pope's title of address. I mean, it really doesn't matter. But if you're presenting yourself as someone who's qualified to argue against the claims of a sect, you ought to know at least the basic pertinent information about that sect, such as what their leader is called. And it was clear to me by that statement alone that he didn't really know anything about Catholicism, hadn't read enough sources. But to a late 2nd century forger, a group of Christians apostatizing at their trial would have seemed perfectly normal. It was just one of them things. And he, of course, probably would have frowned on it, but it happened. And it was a big subject in the literature of the time. And the person who argued that, well, no forger would have written down that any Christian would deny Christ, it's like, that's a lazy argument and hardly even worth refuting. Before we begin, I wanted to share what the radical critic Darrell Doty from the 1990s said about the motive for forging Pliny's letter. Quote, "Why would later Christians invent a dialogue like this between Pliny and Trajan? To begin with, it supports the Christian myth that from the very beginning, Christians were persecuted for no reason at all, except for the fact that they were Christians. That to be a Christian means to share the suffering and death of Christ. All attempts by Christian historians to determine the real reasons why Christians were persecuted fail to recognize the apologetic and mythical character of such claims, for which the most important point is that there were no reasons. At the same time, however, Trajan's instructions would be very favorable to Christians when persecution did take place in the 3rd and early 4th centuries. Christians should not be hunted down. Charges against Christians must be proven in a court of law. Anonymous accusations have no merit, and Christians who deny their faith should be pardoned, a stipulation many Christians later made use of." End quote. So we continue our close reading to demonstrate that Pliny's letter is a forgery and therefore doesn't conflict with the idea of a late origin for Christianity. We'll be going over every sentence in the letter and using our red cards that we introduced in episode 10, the specific arguments against its authenticity, and hold them up whenever appropriate, which is basically every other word. As we go forward, we should always keep our key question in mind, which is whether it's in fact impossible to ever doubt that this letter is in fact a forgery. Back after this. There are 8 key arguments against the authenticity of this letter, 8 red cards, which we'll be showing to Pliny the Younger again and again throughout the rest of the close reading. When this is all over, for Pliny, the visible light spectrum will consist solely of one color. Red card 1 is attestation, which is the strange textual history of the letter, and the fact that Trajan's statements in his response are not cited again in Roman history as having the force of law. And we already saw some of that in the opening reading. Red card 2, the persecution trope. There is a very peculiar way in which the early Christians describe the circumstances of their own persecution. It is stereotyped, fully conforms to Christian expectations and a Christian worldview. And this stereotype portrayal of persecution is not only reflected in the Pliny letter, but it's clear that the forger assumes that his readers will be closely familiar with it. Red card 3 and 4, peculiarities of the style, peculiarities of the situation. These cover the strange inconsistencies that we find throughout the letter and the various unanswered questions that it raises. Red card 5, the lack of incidents of Christianity. Given what we know about the spread of earliest Christianity, the events described in the letter would not and could not have been occurring in this place and time. Red card 6, mere anachronism. Red card 7, intertextuality. We find references to the New Testament and to other Christian books, and the Pliny letter itself seems to be modeled on other entries in the book 10 of the Epistulae in which it appears. And lastly, red card 8, low-key Christian propaganda. Now, when I started this close reading in episode 11, I joked about reading the Latin text with the English, but Actually, by popular demand, I will briefly read the Latin each time, followed by the English. Pliny, activate. Solemne est mi, Domine, omnia de quibus dubito ad te referre. Quis enim potest vel cunctationem meam regere vel ignorantiam instruere. Cognitionibus de Christianis interfui numquam, idea nescio quidet quatenos ad poniri soleat ad quaeri. It's my custom, my lord, to bring before you everything about which I'm in doubt. For who can better guide my uncertainty or better inform my ignorance? I've never been present at trials of Christians. I therefore don't know what the charge usually is and to what extent it's punished. I would have immediately carded Pliny's ass for that first sentence for style reasons, because it sounds like he's beginning this letter with an elaborate apology for no reason, but to some extent, we see this elsewhere in Book 10. I won't say that the introductions are as flattering as we see here, but in letter 31, he begins by saying, "You may stoop when necessary, my lord, to give ear to my problems, without prejudice to your eminent position, seeing that I have your authority to refer to you when in doubt." In the letter where he asks if he's allowed to use a postage stamp, he says, "I pray you, my lord, to tell me your wishes and settle my doubts." Now, Trajan in letter 82 says to Pliny on a different subject, "You need not have had any doubts, my dear Pliny, about the matter on which you thought it necessary to consult me." And that looks suspiciously like the intro to the Christian's letter, at least in English. In Latin, it's quite different, but same concept. Pliny refers to Trajan on matters where he's in doubt. Now, I will say that the last time that Pliny introduced a letter this way was all the way back in letter 56, when he says, "May I express my deepest gratitude, my lord, that in the midst of your important preoccupations you've seen fit to direct me on matters on which I've sought your advice. I pray that you'll do so once again." And he never intros a letter like this again until letter 96, which is this Christian one. And he doesn't do so ever again after this. Now, if the Christian letter was not originally in this collection, that would make sense. The fact that he stopped apologizing for writing halfway through the collection, because by that point, it's like, yeah, we got it, Pliny. You're allowed to write to Trajan for advice whenever you're in doubt. And obviously, Trajan knows that by now. I mean, he says it a lot towards the beginning, and then he stops. Then he does this insanely elaborate and ornate introduction for this Christian's letter, and then he's right back again to introing his letters informally, like, "So, Trage, what are we going to do about these here firemen?" Since I already believe that the letter is a forgery, it's second nature to me to suggest that when the forger produced this Christian's letter, he had a choice of doing the flattering intro or just jumping into the letter. And I think it's very clear that he had enough artifice and enough time on his hands to do the flattering intro, but I recognize that that's a weak argument to establish forgery. I'm just making note of it here because I plan on throwing absolutely everything I have at this fucking thing. So no red card for intertextuality here, maybe a yellow card. But some commentators have said that the reason Pliny is writing such an elaborate apology at the beginning of this letter is because he knows at the outset that it's going to be a long one. So we will actually throw up a red card now on the grounds of style for this letter's length. The letter about Christians is 419 words long in Latin, about 1,000 words in English. The average length of the letters in Book 10 is about 88 words. The second longest letter is 323 words, but in that one, he is literally copy-pasting 4 smaller letters into it. Without those additions, it's only 122 words. And he apologizes there for bothering Trajan as well. And the third longest, in which he also apologizes for its length, is only 278 words, which ends up being about half the length of the Pliny letter in English. Everything else is basically a paragraph or two. Now, we already know that the epistles of the New Testament are by far the longest in antiquity, and we know from prior episodes that that is because they are treatises, merely dressed up in the forms of letters. And so in the Christian epistles, certain elements of Greco-Roman letters and Hellenistic Jewish letters were retained, but one convention that was discarded by the Christians almost immediately was brevity. Not into the whole brevity thing. And in those pseudepigraphal pagan letters that are self-consciously posing as personal letters, the authors allow themselves to be constrained by that format and to play around in it. But in the Christian pseudepigraphal letters, from the beginning, it was like, yeah, okay, I'll make it look like a letter. I'll write, dear so-and-so, but I've got certain things I need to cover, and this treatise or this letter is not getting wrapped up until I cover them. As Patricia Rosenmeyer said in the book Ancient Epistolary Fictions, the idea was that a letter is supposed to take up one sheet of papyrus. Like, she says that the letters of Herodotus were 98 words on average, and I'm reminded of a quote from FDR, who said that if you want your memo to be read, make sure you fit it all on one page. And I guess there was a similar rule in the ancient world. Maybe someone like Pericles once said that, if you want your letter read, make sure you fit it on one papyrus. So this is a lengthy letter. But the Christian wall of text tradition aside, might we be able to account for its length in some other way? We might find a clue to that in Pliny's treatment of geography here, because unlike the vast majority of the letters in Book 10, this letter, letter 96, contains no specific information that would enable the reader to place it in the province of Bithynia and Pontus. And Pliny is someone who is very particular about specifying how the actions he's taken or how the problems he's facing affect the specific cities and towns of the region. He talks about a new bath at Prusa. He talks about a new garrison for Byzantium. He sends Trajan a petition from the people of Nicaea. A fire broke out in Nicomedia, he says, when I was visiting another part of the province. He personally inspects temples, canals, baths, of course, all in specific named places. He inspects the finances of the town of Apamea, and I'm just scratching the surface with these, believe me. Yet here in this Christian letter, we find ourselves magically transported back to that same mysterious wonderland in which the New Testament books were written, where chronology and geography are merely optional. Like, there would have to be a Manhattan Project of the top scholars in the world working around the clock for years to figure out where letters like James and Jude were written from. They seem like they were written in an event horizon. When we consider the geography of the New Testament, we're reminded of Strabo's account of the journey of Pythias to the lost land of Ultima Thule, where he said, there was no longer land properly so called, nor sea, nor air, but a kind of substance concreted from all those elements, resembling a marine lung, a thing in which the earth, the sea, and all the elements are held in suspension, and you can neither sail nor walk. This is the same fantasy land to which we're transported in the Pliny letter, which is damn strange, considering that Book 10 of the letters might as well contain an itinerary. It's so detailed as to where everything's taking place, usually. But this Christian letter is not given any kind of setting in life. Shortly before this letter, Pliny had been spending time in Amisos, which is a burg all the way out on the Lycus River, halfway to Armenia, and the city of Amisos technically had its own laws, which would have probably come up if that was the place where this Christian controversy happened. And shortly after the Christian letter, we find Pliny writing from Amastris, which is 283 miles in the opposite direction as the modern Turkish car cruises. Exactly where did Pliny encounter this gigantic nest of Christians, which was apparently threatening all of civilization? And these letters were not written that far apart from each other in time. I mean, they're not dated, of course, but time in Book 10 is marked by certain events that Pliny mentions, like he mentions the anniversary of Trajan's accession every year. And Pliny's letter reminds us of other Christian forgeries, even those outside the New Testament, where the authors seem to be going out of their way to set the book in zero space. No particulars about the location and the environment are mentioned. The New Testament authors write that way because they're deliberately trying to conceal those things because they're consciously writing fiction. We see the same thing in the Pliny letter and call that a red card for peculiarities of the situation, even though we were already in the midst of red carding Pliny for peculiarities of style because of the length. But the length relates to this geography issue too, because what I think happened was that the forger was only vaguely aware of Pliny's Book 10, and was not really in a position to match his creation with the existing letters, and so it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's the tallest kid in the picture, so to speak. It's as if the forger hadn't actually read Book 10. Maybe he only saw a handful of the letters and kind of got the gist, like some Christian paymaster met the forger in a darkened alley with a manila envelope and was like, "I need you to forge something that looks like this and make it look like an accident." And in that envelope were like the 2 or 3 longest letters, like letter 81 or something. Now, over the centuries, this Christian letter would actually be cleaned up somewhat before it was officially folded into Book 10. And that's not conjecture. I'll demonstrate that when we more closely cover Jerome's mention of it. So we see evidence that this letter was touched up over the years. And finally, in the 5th century, it came time to stick it in Book 10. And the fraudsters of the time probably weren't sure exactly where it would best fit in the collection. So they tucked it in between the Amisos section and the Amastris section. And I think they put it there because this leg of Pliny's journey through his province was the furthest it could be from any of the big famous population centers further west. But like I said, uncharacteristically of Pliny's letters in Book 10, the copiously detailed events that he describes could have taken place on the moon, let alone anywhere in Bithynia and Pontus, which, by the way, many commentators I've read, they tend to abbreviate it as BP, which is always kind of weird to me because it makes it sound like Pliny's running an oil company in these books. But if oil companies are big on decorating their offices with baths, I think that Pliny would in fact make a very excellent oil executive. So that's 2 red cards that we issued. One for it being too long, didn't read, and the other for it apparently being set in cloud cuckoo land. Moving on. Now, of course, the last 2 episodes of this show focused heavily on another red card that we showed to Pliny for this section, red card 2, the persecution trope. The mere fact that he's talking about there being trials of Christians indicates that Christianity was in some way illegal. Remember that the narrative about Christians always being hated by the Romans, always being thrown to the lions, always being hunted down, that's a narrative to which we have become habituated. It's one of those bad habits. And we, of course, found that in this case, the forger invites the reader to simply assume that the Romans persecute Christians as a matter of course, and we found that there was no precedent for that. There's a debate among theologians as to whether Christianity was made illegal by a specific law or whether the actions against them were kind of an ad hoc, standing custom among Roman magistrates. But that second option is really just a way to help these persecution stories make sense. If Christianity existed in the early 2nd century, and if it turned out that the Christians of the early 2nd century were being persecuted by Pliny and others under just like an ad hoc application of their extraordinary powers to keep peace, the cognitio extra ordinem it's called, then we would still expect Christianity to be better documented by the Romans. It's almost no different than saying that there was an actual law on the books against Christianity, which we demonstrated in the last 2 episodes was not the case. You're not going to save this thing by claiming that Pliny was just following some ad hoc procedure here. Now, technically, the persecution trope should be considered an anachronism since it comes from the late 100s AD, but as I said earlier, the persecution trope is so important in discussing the Pliny letter that it really deserves its own red card, but we've spent a lot of time on it, so we'll move on now to something else. Now I'm going to read another entry from Book 10, which is 1/4 the length of this Christian's letter, but is nonetheless uncannily similar to it in many respects. In fact, I think that this document and the rescript of Hadrian from our reading were among the materials, the templates, used by the forger in crafting the letter about Christians. It's Pliny's letter 65 to Trajan, the Bedi Radice translation, quote, "A serious problem, my lord, which affects the whole province, concerns the status and cost of maintenance of the persons generally known as threptos, or foundlings. I've looked at the orders of your predecessors, but was unable to find either a particular case or a general rule which could apply to Bithynia. So I decided I must ask you for directions, as I felt it wasn't sufficient to be guided only by precedents in a matter which required your authoritative opinion. An edict referring to Andania was quoted to me, which was said to be one issued by the deified emperor Augustus. Also, letters of the deified emperors Vespasian and Titus to the Spartans, and another from Titus to the Achaeans. There were also letters from Domitian to the governors Avidius Nigrinus and Armenius Brocchus, and yet another to the Spartans from Domitian. I haven't sent copies of them to you as they seem to be inaccurate, and some of them of doubtful authenticity. And I felt sure that you had accurate and genuine versions among your official files. End quote. Pliny kind of talks like a guy from the Star Wars prequels. I could see him being in that trade federation. And this is Trajan's response to that letter. Quote, "The question you raise of free persons who were exposed at birth, then brought up in slavery by those who rescued them, has often been discussed, but I can find nothing in the records of my predecessors which could have applied to all provinces. There are, it is true, the letters from Domitian to Avidius Nigrinus and Armenius Brocchus, which ought possibly to give us guidance, but Bithynia is not one of the provinces covered by his ruling. I'm therefore of the opinion that those who wish to claim emancipation on this ground shouldn't be prevented from making a public declaration of their right to freedom, nor should they have to purchase their freedom by refunding the cost of their maintenance." Now, there's a lot going on here, but it's very similar to the Christian letter because he speaks of something being a serious problem that affects his area. There's some hint that this is already a matter of settled law, but he himself hasn't been able to find the answer anywhere, and so he writes to Trajan for advice. What he's really looking for is a precedent. The people that they're talking about, the foundlings, were those who were exposed at birth when they were children, left to die, and someone essentially picked them up and raised them, and 99.9% of the time they raised them as slaves, even though under Roman law they were considered freeborn. The problem here is that when these kids are growing up and claiming their freeborn status, the people who raised them are claiming that they're entitled to compensation for raising them. It's a tricky legal problem, much like the trials of Christians from our letter, but look how they handle it. The first thing Pliny says is, it's a serious problem. So this is a big issue, just like in the Christian letter where he says, the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially because of the number of people in danger. Okay, so sentence 1 of the Foundlings letter, we've got a situation on our hands. Sentence 2 of the Foundlings letter, he says, quote, "I've looked at the orders of your predecessors, but was unable to find a particular case or general rule, so I decided to ask you for directions." Now, this is the kind of thing the Christian letter should have said if it was written by a Roman legate. Pliny then says here in the Foundling letter that he examined 5 potential sources to find precedents for his problem, and they were letters from previous emperors. And by the way, notice here how Pliny says that he didn't trust all of those sources because he suspected that some of them were inauthentic. Pliny is more skeptical about letters written over the name of an emperor than Christian apologists are. Isn't that ironic? I mean, I think it is. I think it's like rain on your wedding day. And then he ends the letter there and asks Trajan for input. Trajan's response immediately begins with him saying that he himself tried to find precedents as well. Of course, what that means is that his secretaries tried to find them. And then he says that he couldn't find a precedent. So he gives an ex cathedra statement on what he recommends that Pliny should do and frames it as him giving his opinion. If the Christian letter looked like this, born in the 2nd century would not be a show. It would just be me ranting in a metro station behind an open guitar case. Pliny's Christian letter is doing too much. If the Foundling letter looked like the Christian letter, it would say something like this, quote, "Dear Trajan, there's a big problem having to do with foundlings. Now, I don't know anything whatsoever about foundlings and how their cases are resolved, but anyway, I've been resolving their cases this entire time. And what I've been doing is, for the ones that were 18 and older, I've been making them pay the cost of their upkeep. For those 18 and younger, I've been dismissing their cases and whipping their parents for good measure. But then I decided that I should actually study up on this issue, so I tortured a few lawyers, and I learned that this issue is much more complicated than I thought. I mean, who knew? So I thought that I would write to you because it seems to me that making the adult foundlings pay their way would be a pretty darn good policy." End quote. And then Trajan would respond with something that only obliquely touches on the issues that Pliny raised. But the Foundling letter, as it appears in Book 10, is what the Christian letter should look like. But instead, with the Christian letter, we're in a legal black hole for some reason. I mean, this is what the Christian letter should say, quote, "Dear Trajan, we got a situation here. I'm doing trials of Christians, but I'm not sure what the procedure is. I looked at letters of Nero and Domitian for guidance. I also called up my friends Tacitus and Suetonius, who know somewhat about laws passed against Christians, but all my sources are confusing and contradictory, and I need guidance." And Trajan could write back and say, "I agree that the prior guidance is confusing, and I myself encountered the same problem when I did my research. So here's what I think. You should give the Christians a chance to deny their faith, and if they do, let them off the hook." The forger could not write his letter that way because if he did, one, he wouldn't have been able to include the lengthy section about the confessors, deniers, and apostates, and he needs that section because he doesn't want the Romans to consider apostates liable for the unspeakable crimes. Two, he wouldn't have had any room to whack in all his pro-Christian statements like how they would never curse Christ, how they were tanking the economy, how everyone in the province is in danger of becoming a Christian. Three, the forger's audience accepts the persecution trope. The forger's audience, quote unquote, knows that the Romans try to make Christians deny the name. Ergo, Pliny must try to make Christians deny the name. However, if Pliny was trying to get Christians to deny the name in real life, then he didn't need to write to Trajan. In that case, he already knew what to do about Christians, which is try to get them to deny the name. But the forger has a much greater concern that he wants to address, which is whether Christians or even ex-Christians can be narked on or hunted down based on suspicion of the flagitia, the unspeakable crimes. So he has Pliny say to Trajan right at the beginning of the letter that he doesn't know what the charge usually is. That's the way to prime the pump, to get the letter off the ground. So we red-carded Pliny for peculiarities of style. The letter is not structured in such a way as it should be if he's stabbing for a precedent. Moving on. We've got another red card for that ass. We're still in this small section at the beginning, by the way. And speaking of precedents, we now present another red card to Pliny for peculiarities of the situation because Pliny is depicted as not knowing anything about trials of Christians and how they're conducted. Now, traditionally, whenever someone has suggested that the Pliny letter is inauthentic, the first thing they usually say is that it's not really believable that Pliny would represent himself as being completely unfamiliar with trials of Christians, let alone Christians themselves, because he'd been a lawyer in Rome for an entire generation. Rome was where Nero's persecution of the Christians after the Great Fire supposedly occurred. Rome was the place in which Nero supposedly passed a bunch of laws against the Christians, as Suetonius says in the passage that I tagged as a forgery. Pliny served as consul, which was the highest post in the civil administration, almost a kind of president, in which any and all matters that affected the peace and justice of the empire would have come across his desk. Now, the usual response from apologists would be that, yeah, Pliny had been a lawyer, but most of his cases were in the centumviral court and involved financial matters, estate law, and so on. But as the theologian L.H. Canfield pointed out, the Christians couldn't have been entirely unknown to Pliny because at the beginning of his career, he had been military tribune in Syria, where the Christians were supposedly especially numerous. Now, Canfield also points out something that rarely gets acknowledged here. As we'll talk about, Pliny just throws out the term Christians as if both he and Trajan already know about these people. He does not explain the term Christian. Trajan is automatically assumed to know what it means. But what Canfield points out is that Pliny, who says that he doesn't know what the charge usually is in trials of Christians, doesn't actually reveal how he became aware of Christians at all. Again, he knows of their existence, knows that the profession of their superstition is illegal, but it feels like we're missing something key here from his testimony. Richard Carrier actually said that Pliny's lack of knowledge about Christianity confirms that it was only an obscure sect at the time, but that raises even greater questions because from the way the letter is framed, knowledge of the Christians' existence is assumed, but the specific thing that Pliny doesn't know is how to try them in court. Now, some might be objecting to their car radio right now that, well, he became aware of them because they were brought before him by accusers in these courts where he's serving as governor. If that were the case, that he's only just now becoming aware of Christians, wouldn't we therefore expect him to introduce them to Trajan here in his opener? The thing is, this is another one of those problems with the letter that the theologians have tried to explain, and one that apologists and the general press of believers simply ignore. And Canfield himself, who was a staunch Christian, said that Pliny must have been acting according to some standing procedure that's now unknown to us. I mean, that's great, but there's no indication of that anywhere in the text. It rather looks like whoever wrote this assumed that the reading public of this letter would automatically know what a Christian is. In fact, this is dramatic irony in that we know what a Christian is as the readers, and we join Pliny the Younger on his journey in which he learns what a Christian is. What the forger is doing here is two things. One, he's trying to underline the fact that the authority of the local officials is limited in scope. This was especially important in a time in which the greatest potential threat to a Christian may have come from local officials. So he, like the forger of Hadrian's rescript from our reading, is trying to put out into the ether that no, the local officials can't be a law unto themselves. They should rather be following some fixed procedure. It happens to be the same exact thing that Justin Martyr, Tertullian, the forger of Hadrian's rescript, as well as the forger of the letter of the Emperor Antoninus to the Assembly of Asia were calling for, and we'll cover that last one next time. The second thing the forger's doing here is deploying a literary device. For the letter to even get off the ground, Pliny has to go on a journey, so to speak. And his journey is that he starts off not even knowing anything about Christians, and then he has many quick learning experiences in rapid succession, kind of like Siddhartha. But at the end, he's still confused. And this is all being done to set the table for Trajan's response, which is the main course of this forgery, so to speak. Back after this.
There's a teapot in outer space.
I'd like to go ahead and present Pliny with another red card for mere anachronism because of his free and easy use of the term Christian. First of all, despite the fact that by this time there had probably been about 975,000 obscure religious sects in the history of the Roman Empire, despite the fact that you could have thrown a rock into any crowd on earth and hit a follower of some arcane, recondite local god that no one had ever heard of, Pliny just throws out the term Christian with no explanation whatsoever and assumes that Trajan is automatically going to know exactly what he's talking about. Again, we know what Christians are. The forger knows what Christians are. But it's not a given that Trajan would have automatically known what the hell Pliny was referring to. I pointed out in episode 4 in the section on anachronisms in the Gospel of Mark that the term Christian was not in common currency in the early decades of Christianity because it began its life as kind of a slur. Even up to the 170s, Christians are still having a hard time accepting it, though it did come into wider currency before then. Now, the Gospel of Mark goes out of its way to carefully avoid using the term because the author recognizes either that it would be an anachronism for the 30s AD, or he's aware that it's an insult, but he doesn't have any other idea of what to call the followers of Jesus. And we talked about Barnabas in the 130s having not even a vague hint of knowledge that this is what he and his co-religionists are supposed to be called. In the New Testament, the word Christian appears for the first time in that strange boundary halfway through Acts of the Apostles, where the author-editor is beginning to segue from his mainstream source to his Pauline source. I call it the DMZ of Acts of the Apostles. It's basically chapters 10 through 13. In Acts chapter 11, it says, "After Barnabas found Saul, he led him into Antioch. And it happened that for an entire year, they met with the church and taught a fairly large crowd. And also, for the first time, the disciples were called Christians in Antioch." Acts contains the word Christian in one other place. In chapter 26, Paul says, "King Agrippa, do you have faith in the prophets? I know you have faith." But the Agrippa declared to the Paul, "In only this short time, you're going to persuade me to make myself a Christian." Acts of the Apostles is usually placed in the 80s or the 90s AD, but more and more theologians have been putting it in the 2nd century. And I want to say here that many of you might be familiar with a book called Dating Acts by Richard Pervo, but might not yet have had the chance to read it. And the Acts series will be the absolute biggest thing we ever do on this show, Acts of the Apostles. If you don't end up believing that Christianity had a late origin after we cover that, I don't know what to tell you. Because in only that short time, I'm going to persuade you to make yourself a late dater. And in the series, we'll talk about Richard Pervo's book, but I'll just tell you his conclusion now. 852 billion pages on the redating of Acts. He concludes that it should be placed at 115 AD. And I get the strong sense that he was pulling his punches because his actual investigation in the body of the book seems to suggest a much later date. The 115 ends up being anticlimactic, but he was still a New Testament professor, had to play the game. And some mainstream theologians have been putting Acts even later in the 140s and 150s. My date for Acts is between 155 and 165. It was written by a contemporary of Justin Martyr. The author-editor of Acts has a very similar approach to Christianity as does Justin, maybe a bit more advanced in places, but if Justin had had Acts at his disposal, it would have made his life much easier. Therefore, I'm saying that Acts of the Apostles is one of the latest books in the New Testament. And it is also one of 2 books out of the whole 27 that contain the term Christian. The other is 1 Peter. Now, on the date of 1 Peter, it's another one of those undatable texts, so the theologians are all over the map. I've seen it placed as early as 67 and as late as the 140s. I put it at 145 to 155, and I'll explain that in the 1 Peter series, but where the word Christian occurs in 1 Peter is in a section that's even later than the main body of the text. 1 Peter was a kind of a rewrite of a baptismal sermon to bring it more in line with Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And after that, it was considered decent enough by the compiler of the New Testament to come in and add some ecclesiastical material and then add it to the canon. And these additions are part of what the theologian Winsome Monroe called the pastoral stratum. Basically, an editor at some point in the 2nd century, the late 2nd century, came in and did a pass over the letters of the New Testament and added material with similar language throughout, similar themes, trying to bring the text more in line with what we can call early Catholicism. Now, the relevant part of 1 Peter is this, quote, "If you're reviled in the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he's not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. Because it's time for judgment to begin from the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who don't obey the gospel of God?" 1 Peter assumes that Christians are suffering for the name, which is why, if you were wondering, some of the mainstream theologians have given it such a late date. In other words, 1 Peter follows the persecution trope. It's also clearly been written by or at the behest of an official cleric who is made to say, "I exhort the presbyters among you as your fellow presbyter." Of course, it's being written in the name of Peter, but the mere fact that Peter would be made to describe himself as a presbyter makes this document later than the Queen's period. Now, on my timeline, the only 2 biblical texts that use the term Christian were written after 150 AD. And on my timeline, Not many other biblical texts were written after 150 AD. To me, this is an indication that the term Christian wasn't in common currency until around that time. But this isn't the strongest argument that there is, considering that some listeners of this show, might still place Acts in the 80s, 1 Peter maybe in the 90s. If you don't agree with my late dates for the books, then you're not going to agree with me that the term Christian wasn't widespread until the mid-2nd century. So let's look at the term Christian itself. As we're told by the theologian E.A. Judge, the term Christian originated in Latin because of the way its suffix is formed. The Greek term for Christian is cognate of the Latin rather than the other way around like we'd expect, and the suffix in the term Christiani implies followers of a specific figure, usually a political figure, in this case somebody called Christ. It's a demeaning term like you would apply to a faction, like the Catalonians or something like that. During the reign of Nero, there was a group called the Augustans, who were basically like Nero's entourage. They were supposed to go around and applaud him for his artistic performances. In other words, it's closer to the name of a faction or the name of a party or sect. We could in some way take it to mean messianists, but the Latin speakers who developed this term didn't know what a messiah was because Christos means anointed with oil, and they probably thought that it meant like followers of the wet one or the soaked one. And the name couldn't have derived from Jews when Christians were still mostly among their ranks, because in that case, those Jews would be effectively conceding that Christians followed the Messiah, which of course they would never have conceded. And we can consider different theories about how this word first came into being, like whether it originated among Roman soldiers during the Bar Kokhba rebellion of the 130s or something else. But I think the fact that it occurs in that DMZ section of Acts of the Apostles gives us a clue, the boundary line between the editor's mainstream source and his Pauline source. And right at that boundary line, he makes the statement that around this time was when they were first called Christians. It's a piece of information that he clearly got from his Pauline source, the one we've been calling the Lost Acts of Paul. It would seem to me that the term Christian originated among the followers of the Pauline church as a kind of insulting epithet against the followers of the mainstream church, the men from James. And if you remember from episode 7 and 8, these were presenting themselves as the followers of a specific historical person. And I said that the Romans wouldn't have understood the term Messiah. Well, there's also another group that didn't understand that term, which was Paul's church. In Paul's letters, the term Christos is used as if it's the deity's first name. Well, when the super apostles, the mainstream Christians, the men from James roll into town and claim that their lineage actually goes back to a real person with that name, then the Pauline sectarians could have formed this term of abuse, with the implication being that, you dopes are just the followers of some guy called Christos, whereas we're worshiping the actual deity. Now with this, we would then have to explain why the Pauline church, which appears to have been primarily Greek-speaking, would have used an epithet derived from Latin. Well, this is only a working theory, but it's not impossible, especially since we see that the Pauline church had communities in Roman colonies like Corinth and Philippi. In point of fact, Philippi was explicitly founded as a Roman colony, and every Pauline community that we know of was also a commercial port. So it could be that the members of this church spoke a kind of Latin-infused patois in their daily lives. The Didache, which is another undatable text, but comes at least from before the year 150, views the term Christian with discomfort. It's almost a kind of insult to the author. Barnabas, as we've said many times, a book clearly written in the 2nd century by Christians for Christians, yet is not aware that the term Christian exists. The author of Mark, as we said, limbos underneath the term. The point is, Christian was not just a term that people freely threw around back in them days. However, its use in Pliny's letter implies that it's a term that's well known. It's a term he's conversant with, and as I said, he assumes that Trajan will be conversant with it as well and will require no additional explanation. The traditional timeline, the conventional narrative, the consensus is that the term Christian was indeed originally a term of abuse, and according to the theologians, it started being used sometime after 80 AD and was slowly embraced by Christians in the following decades. I don't see how that can be supported when even books that theologians would agree are from the mid-2nd century and even later, like Tatian, like the Shepherd of Hermas, like Barnabas, why books like these seem to be studiously avoiding the term. Now, an argument could be made that the Romans, like Pliny, began using the term first, especially if it had insulting connotations, and therefore, if you accept the traditional timeline, Pliny's use of the term Christian here lines up perfectly with that. And the argument there would be that, yeah, the Christians themselves don't yet accept the term, but the Romans, of course, don't care. They're going to apply it without any scruple. I just think that if that's the case, this term would be much better attested in Roman sources before this, and especially Roman laws, because as it stands, Pliny is technically the first Roman source to use the term, and even Tacitus, who writes after him, will actually be using the term Christians. And that's assuming that both references in both writers are genuine. But the forger is actually operating in the late 2nd century. The term Christian is now more or less in common currency. That earlier generation, the one who'd lived through the Bar Kokhba War and its aftermath, the ones who lived through the street fights with Paul's church, the ones who were most resistant to having the term Christian applied to them, they've more or less passed away by this point. Now the term Christian has pretty much been embraced by the church, just like these sectarian exonyms like Methodist and others that ends up being embraced by the members. The forger would have no conception of the very slow acceptance of the term Christian because he, like modern apologists, is getting his church history from Acts of the Apostles, which testifies that the term Christian had an ancient provenance. He calls himself a Christian. He calls his fellow worshippers Christians. Therefore, Pliny calls these people Christians. Now, another thing that theologians also agree on when it comes to this is that for the term Christians to be used by anyone, Christians had to be socially distinguishable from Jews, and that leads me to my next argument against Pliny's letter. But before moving on, I want to say one more thing on the use of the term Christian. You may be aware that there was an inscription uncovered in Pompeii back when that was excavated in the 19th century. Of course, it was destroyed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. There was an inscription uncovered that may have contained the term Christians, and the building in which it was found was therefore magically transformed by these early archaeologists into the hospital of the Christians. Until well into the 20th century, archaeologists had a habit of letting written sources direct their conclusions, and this was especially bad in the excavation of sites in the Middle East, where any ruined structure that looked like it could have once had 4 walls was therefore supposed to be some building referenced in the Old Testament. You know, here's what looks like a stable, so therefore it must have been Solomon's stable, things like that. On the subject of biblical archaeology, and I forget where I read this, but someone was criticizing it and said, like, okay, say you're a biblical archaeologist who's trying to prove that the events of the book of Joshua happened. Now, the book of Joshua contains a story in which a woman named Rahab lets down a scarlet thread from her window to signal to the invading Israelites that she had aided their spies, and so she should be spared from punishment when they take over. So what does the archaeologist think he's going to do to prove that this story happened? Like look for one house in the outer wall that appears to have been relatively undamaged? I mean, does he look for the scarlet thread? But that's the kind of thing that those early archaeologists were up to. They just saw what they wanted to see out there in the field. So archaeology has come a long way. It's much more sane and scientific in our time, whereas 150 years ago, it was a branch of Christian apologetics mostly. Whatever happened with archaeology, I recommend that biblical studies undergo that same transformation process. I don't know whether that involves group therapy, medication, 40 sessions of neurofeedback, but nonetheless, get it done. The graffito in Pompeii that may have mentioned Christians is no longer extant. It deteriorated soon after it was uncovered, and what we have are the sketches that a few eyewitnesses recorded in their notebooks. Just like with most ancient graffiti, there are lacunae, there are differences on whether the word Christianos is actually present. No two people on earth can agree in their reconstructions of this thing. It's just inconclusive, and the honest critics will admit that. That's actually the consensus, that it's inconclusive. I would actually say that the opinion tends more to be on the side of it not saying Christians, since among other things, Christians are completely unattested elsewhere in these destroyed towns, but for what it's worth, it is the universal opinion of Christian apologists that the graffito contained the word Christians. If it did, it raises some important questions, like, for example, why the hell are Christians attested only in one ruined city in the entire 1st century, yet in every other square inch of the empire that we've examined, we can find no physical attestation of Christians until the 150s in Rome, and that by adherents of a Christian heresy, the Valentinians. We don't start seeing regular archaeological evidence of Christians until the end of the 2nd century. Really, the early 3rd century is when the evidence starts to pick up. So I guess the Christians were damn lucky that the one place on Earth in the 1st century where they left physical evidence was precisely the one place in which hordes of Christian archaeologists flocked to during a time period when archaeology was just a branch of Christian apologetics. Also, for what it's worth, Tertullius, in his apology book, explicitly says that there had been no Christians in Pompeii when it was destroyed. Quote, "Nor had Tuscia and Campania to complain of Christians in the days when fire from heaven overwhelmed Volsini and Pompeii was destroyed by fire from its own mountain." On this, the theologian Thomas Waymond said that this statement by the Christian author Tertullius was clearly apologetic and shouldn't be taken as conclusive evidence. Man, give me a break. I talk about apologetics. This is what's so frustrating when dealing with Christian academics. It's like when Tertullian says something that we hate, he was exaggerating. But when he says something that we like, we have to take him seriously. And you're just a mere contrarian if you try to argue that he's lying. I mean, didn't I say something similar on this in episode 11 with that Tacitus passage? So fuck out of here with this Pompeii inscription. We had to bring it up to investigate early uses of the term Christian, but now we'll go to our next red card. Pliny now receives another red card for anachronism for somehow being able to completely distinguish Christians from Jews. In this, he is almost a century ahead of his time. In fact, in this, he is already more advanced than most Christians of the period. It's kind of strange that Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus, all of whom are supposedly external witnesses of the Christians in their early days, and all of whom have had questions raised against their authenticity, every single one of them has absolutely no difficulty with identifying Christians as a completely distinct sect from Judaism, when even the author of the book of Revelation, where if you accept the conventional view of that book, he's writing in the 90s AD and still considers himself a Jew. The Gospel of Matthew is another one of those books that doesn't seem to know whether it's coming or going. You know, the Gospel of Mark still has Jesus say the full Shema prayer. The indisputably late letter of Barnabas from the 130s is still portraying the conflict between Christians and Jews as internecine. Christian texts like the Pseudo-Clementina, the Apostolic Constitutions contain huge blocks of Jewish material that is only lightly edited. And the Christians were able to assimilate Jewish books like the Didache, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, the Sibylline Oracles with only the barest patina of editing. And this question of the parting of the ways, when were Judaism and Christianity considered two separate entities, is not so cut and dry. And when we read the commentators like Marcel Simon or Daniel Boyarin, even though they're not going far afield with assigning late origins to Christianity itself, we find even in their writings the belief that Christianity and Judaism were not so readily distinguishable, whether to internal or external observers, until at least the 130s. Of course, everyone's aware of Pliny's letter in which there's absolutely no question that Christians are distinguished from Jews, but the response to that, in so many words, is to treat Pliny's letter as like a fluke in this regard. Now, there would have been scope for Pliny to confuse these two religions, at least in theory, because there's some suggestion from Philo and Josephus that Jews could be found in this region already by the 1st century. Of course, Jews were quite numerous in Western Asia Minor, where Pliny made a stopover before arriving in Bithynia. But I want to draw your attention to something important. Recall how in the last episode, we went over the story of the execution of Flavius Clemens and the banishment of Flavia Domitilla during the reign of Domitian. I said incorrectly a few times that Flavia herself was executed, but that was just one of the penalties of talking too fast. But Recall also the story from Suetonius about the enforcement of the Jewish tax. In both stories, the Roman historians are talking about Roman actions taken against Jews, but the apologists and many of the theologians tell us that we're supposed to understand that these stories as really being about Christians because, the Romans couldn't tell the difference. I mean, if you're not eating pork, if you're taking off on Saturdays, if you're worshiping one God, they don't know from Christians. To them, you're Jewish. And that's why they were enforcing this tax. That's why they were banishing this poor woman. The Romans are just confused. But a scant 15 years later, we are supposed to accept that no such confusion exists anymore. And a man who'd lived in Rome during the 90s when this tax issue and this banishment issue occurred with the confusion over Jews and Christians is now somehow 100% capable not only of distinguishing Christians from Jews, but to do so in a way in which there's no possibility of the question even coming up. From the way Pliny tells it, Christianity almost seems like it's been a standalone, independent belief system from the beginning of its existence. Now, you know who else had no problem distinguishing between Christians and Jews? The mainstream Christian clergy of the late 2nd century. The same people who forged this letter. Their books are replete with arguments that Jews and Christians are to be regarded as two separate peoples. It's not even a question for them. Both Justin and Tertullian wrote dialogues against Jews. Tertullian's is literally called Against the Jews. The letter to Diognetus, the writings of Melito, are breathing threats and murder against them. Irenaeus sees them as two separate entities. In fact, he's even suspicious of what we would now call Jewish Christians. A writer from that period called Aristo of Pella also wrote a dialogue against Jews, which has now been lost. But the point is, to the mainstream church of the 180s, 190s, the split had occurred. As for whether it had occurred by the year 111 when Pliny's letter was supposedly written, that is far from clear, even under the traditional timeline. In fact, Pliny, again, is technically one of the first people chronologically to use the term Christian, and he is one of the first chronologically to distinguish Christians from Jews if this letter is genuine. And to say nothing of Trajan, who also doesn't have any problem distinguishing the two, and he has the entire empire in his scope. And Trajan was not considered to be friendly towards Jews. He's depicted as one of their nemeses in the literature. The forger of Pliny's letter, who lived at a time in which Jews and Christians had definitively separated, and who was reinforced in that belief by Acts of the Apostles, which portrays that split as already occurring in like the 50s and 60s AD, is not at all aware of the historical problem that's created by depicting Christians as being readily recognizable as a standalone group, all on their own, and with no association with their mother religion. This is what Celsus says about Christians and Jews in 178 AD, quote, "The discussions they have with each other about Christ are no different from that proverb, a fight about the shadow of an ass. There's nothing of importance in the investigations of the Jews and the Christians because both believe that the divine spirit predicted that one would come as a savior to the human race, but they don't yet agree on whether the predicted person has actually come or not." End quote. In the year 178, some Romans were still able to view Christians and Jews as sectarian rivals. The fact that Pliny brings up the Christians as a distinct sect when stabbing around for a precedent, for some reason it doesn't occur to him whether or not any of the manifold laws and regulations involving Jews might come into play here. This is highly questionable for a Roman administrator of the early 2nd century. It is, however, perfectly explicable coming from the pen of a Christian forger from the late 2nd century. And we'll go to our last red card for the day after this. So Pliny the Younger doesn't know anything about Jews. He never mentions them in his letters. And he doesn't confuse them with Christians, as we said. He also hardly knows anything about Christians either. But nevertheless, Pliny the Younger is found to be a superb student of the Bible. And by the end of this close reading, he's going to end up being the best Bible student in the whole class. We're going to send him home with a set of Bible color forms when this is over. Remember color forms? But he starts showing off his New Testament expertise right away. I quote from Acts chapter 25. "King Agrippa, and all you men who are with us, you see this man about whom all the multitude of the Judeans petitioned to me, both in Jerusalem and in this place, crying out that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he'd done nothing deserving death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. But I don't have anything definite to write about him to my lord. So I brought him before you, and especially you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation happens, I might have something to write. Because it seems irrational to me sending a prisoner and not to also indicate the charges against him." I now quote from Acts chapter 23. "Claudius Lysias to the good leader Felix, greetings. After this man was arrested by the Judeans and was going to be killed by them, I, after I came up to them with the troops, rescued him, after I learned that he is a Roman. Wanting to know the basis for the charges they were bringing against him, I led him to their council, and I found out that he was being charged regarding matters in their law, but with no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. But when I was informed that there was a plot being formed by the Judeans against him, I sent him to you instantly, also sending a message to his accusers to bring the charges against him before you." I now quote from Mark chapter 15. "The Pilate asked him, 'Are you the king of the Judeans?' But he answers, 'You say.' And the chief priests were accusing him of much. But the Pilate asked him again, saying, 'Don't you have anything to answer? Look at how much they're accusing you of.' But the Jesus no longer answered him, and the Pilate marveled. And later, the Pilate answered again and was saying to them, 'Then what do you want me to do with him whom you call King of the Judeans?' But they shouted again, 'Crucify him.' But the Pilate was saying to them, 'For what evil did he do?' But they shouted all the more, 'Crucify him.'" You don't necessarily have to call him the Pilate, but Mark goes out of his way to leave the definite article, so these are far from the only examples I could provide of the New Testament portrayal of Roman officials seeming perplexed whenever a Christian is brought before them in chains. There are at least 4 more examples in Acts, and in the 2 passages from Acts that I read, both Claudius Lysias and Porcius Festus both seem mystified by the charges against Paul, and both of them refer to a superior in writing. The 2 actual officials with judicial powers, that is Pilate and Festus, are both portrayed as seeking advice from a third party. Now, Acts of the Apostles in my timeline was written the closest to the forgery of Pliny's letter. I put Acts in the 160s, but the Gospels too. Pontius Pilate and all these Roman officials have the same strange mental break where they have ultimate power to investigate, to carry out sentence, yet at the moment of truth, they're all made to exhibit this strikingly un-Roman trait of waffling when it comes to performing their duties. Like, they don't even really want to investigate, let alone execute summary judgment. And Pliny is, for whatever reason, in that same category. The Roman officials in the hands of the Christian writers are pawns. And it seems like the Romans in these stories are being held back by something supernatural. And you know, the sad thing is that the fact that these stories are so weird and the author seems so hesitant to portray the Romans as decisive, that has opened up a breach that has allowed all these minimum historical Jesus theories to come flooding in. Because people read these things and they're confused, and rightfully so. I mean, in their mind, Pilate ended up crucifying Jesus, so Jesus was therefore killed by the Roman state. So why this waffling on the part of Pilate when Jesus is brought before him? And it's like, okay, well, maybe Christianity indeed started out as a revolutionary movement, political revolutionaries, and became more spiritualized over time. And here, the later gospel authors and the Acts author is just trying to smooth all that out. And he really has no other way to do that than to make the Romans out to be reluctant executioners. But the thing to remember is that the Romans are clearly not the Christians' friends at the time these books are being written in the 2nd century. Now, the Christians of that time regard the Romans in kind of the same way that, like, wild herbivorous animals regard humans. Like, they're not overtly antagonistic toward them, but there's definitely extreme caution, even a vague hostility. And the thing is that Pilate has to kill Jesus. Lysias and Festus have to speed Paul along to his execution. But God's hand being in all this, they can't enjoy themselves and be in total control the entire time. This decision has to cause them some anguish. And in fact, in all three cases, their hand is eventually forced by an entity called the Jews, which in the minds of the authors are the real villains. By the time of Pliny's letter, Acts has already been written, the Gospels obviously have already been written, and Pliny is a kind of hybrid character standing partway between the one group of Pilate and Lysias and Festus on the one side, and the more inflexible, take no prisoners, stereotypical persecutors like the prefect Urbicus, whom Justin Martyr writes about, and would actually be the Christians' main enemies in season 2 of Christianity. So Pliny is like the summer teaser episode where he's still got a bit of that wishy-washy New Testament feel to him. You know, the producers of this show don't want to alienate their whole fan base, but there are hints here that the show is going to get a lot darker in the next installment. But instead of Pliny's hand being forced by the Jews, which is an entity of which he appears to be entirely unaware, his hand is being forced by the needs of the persecution trope. The persecution trope needs victims, and Pliny at times appears to be the reluctant persecutor because that was the received Christian literary device. But forced into this new setting for one of the first times ever here in the late 2nd century, it clashes markedly with what he will go on to say in the rest of the letter about how he killed these defendants without scruple, killed them for being obstinate, as he says. One of the main problems with the Pliny letter that can be detected even on a surface level reading is Pliny's dramatically oscillating behavior throughout. Here, he's just a hapless schmo, like, duh, I don't know nothing about Christians. They said they didn't do nothing wrong. And there, he's a ruthless maniac, executing until his sword arm is tired. And by the way, this is another one of those problems with the Pliny letter of which theologians are aware, but modern apologists are not. Remember when I mentioned those? Well, what some of them have said is that Pliny starts out being the hapless schmo, but what happened was his governor's council intervened and lit the fire under him because they took the Christian threat more seriously than he did, and that's why Pliny appears to convert into the fucking Terminator halfway through this thing. Goes without saying, no support for that in the text. But I wanted to share that with you to remind you that this document is not without its problems, and theologians have had to come up with theories like that, completely unsupported in that case, to explain them away. At the end of all things, you and I will be familiar with those problems and those BS theories, but the internet screamers who simply repeat Pliny's letter over and over will still be just as much in the dark. I want to close out with a quote from one of the great heroes of this telebroadcast, the radical critic T.L. Strange. He said this about Pliny's letter, and he talks about the passage we read, but also looks ahead to what we'll cover on our next show, where Pliny will describe the actual measures that he's taken in the trials of Christians. Quote, "So we have Pliny represented as entirely ignorant about what the crime of being a Christian involved, feeling that discrimination of circumstances should be exercised in meting out some punishment to them, the nature and scale of which he was, however, incompetent to judge of, needing guidance from the emperor, and yet boldly proceeding to threaten the accused with consequences unless they abandoned he knew not what, and on their refusal, executing them all and informing the emperor that he had done so. This can be no report of any actualities, but simply scene painting of a very inartistic kind." We've continued our close reading and the deployment of our red cards in aid of demonstrating that Pliny's letter is a forgery and so doesn't conflict with the idea of a late origin for Christianity. We will continue our series and our close reading of Pliny's fake letter to Trajan, always keeping in mind that it's not impossible to question it. In the name of Saint Candida, we declare Pliny's letter to be late and spurious. Thank you for listening. This criticism is ended. Go in peace.
stories of mythology do you think of as historical reality?